Jada Pinkett Smith. What's the narcissistic dynamic? Many of you have learned about the news that Jada Pinkett Smith has provided that apparently she and Will Smith have been separated for the last 7 years. I've explained elsewhere that I don't necessarily think that is accurate. But nevertheless, this would prompt many people to wonder, what is the nature of the dynamic then between the two of them? My work is unrivaled in its ability to explain to you in plain terms the way that the dynamic works between narcissist and victim. Most commentators, who basically regurgitate material that they've found elsewhere, talk about this process: seduction, devaluation, and discard. That is a very simplistic approach to the narcissistic dynamic because it fails to take into account numerous variations. My work goes way beyond that, and that's why it brings such clarity for so many people. In the case of Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, they got together at an early juncture where they weren't known to one another, and thus Will Smith was a tertiary source. He wasn't known to her. However, they started to get to know one another and they dated, and thus there was probably some form of intimacy between them, and he became an intimate partner secondary source. It's highly likely that her narcissism identified that he was an empath, that he could be easily controlled, that he's quite an emotional man, therefore there's plenty of fuel to be obtained, and that he came with bundles of character traits and residual benefits. The consequence of which is the narcissism essentially said, we've got an excellent target here, let's get him under control ASAP. Thus he became the candidate intimate partner secondary source placed upon the fast track to get him under control. So he's given plenty of the good stuff, and thus, as a combination of her benign manipulations at that stage as she seduces him and gives him the golden period, and with his increasing emotional thinking driven by his addiction, so he doesn't see any of the red flags, or where he doesn't pay any attention to them, he becomes ensnared. She then embeds him as the intimate partner primary source, and they became married. He gets a golden period thereafter. Typically, the golden period is somewhere between 6 to 18 months. Can be shorter, can be longer, but that's roughly how long it lasts. And then devaluation always, repeat, always follows. Will then gets years of devaluation. But what about this suggestion of there being a separation? What does that mean in terms of the dynamic? Well, first scenario, let us assume it is true, and that they have been separated for the last 7 years. What then has occurred? Well, Will was the intimate partner primary source. On separation, he remained the intimate partner primary source, but then became the former intimate partner primary source because they were no longer together, because they had separated. However, what she would do, like many narcissists do, she doesn't allow the cutting off of the relationship as a whole, and instead she continues to hoover him by no doubt speaking to him, talking about the children, triangulating him with those children, talking about going to therapy, etc., probably still engaging in intimacy. Because although they were supposedly separated, we know that they've had repeated interaction with one another. And therefore, she will have interacted with him still as the former intimate partner primary source, but drawn fuel from him, character traits and residual benefits, when in effect she's taken him off the shelf of his separation, engaged with him, and then she puts him back on the shelf as the former intimate partner primary source. So the dynamic moved, assuming this separation actually occurred, to a shelf dynamic between him and her, where he was former intimate partner primary source. He would be taken off the shelf to be engaged with, but he wouldn't be reinstated to the position of intimate partner primary source. He would still be former IPPS, even though they're interacting with one another. We know that she had an affair during this period of time, and it's possible that August became the intimate partner primary source, with Will as the former intimate partner primary source. Or it could have been, if this was a true 7-year separation, Will remained former intimate partner primary source, and August was an intimate partner secondary source. Thus, throughout this dynamic, because we know that they have been involved with one another, she kept hoovering him as the former IPPS and engaging with him. There might have been instances, of course, of them spending some time together, but because it was a separation, as she described it, therefore he wouldn't be reinstated to the position of IPPS. And all through this period of separation, he would be the former IPPS, with her still hoovering and engaging with him. I've explained elsewhere that I don't believe that it was a true separation where they decided that's it, and therefore they've stayed apart completely. Rather, I think that he has continued to be subjected to the devaluation phase, and during that, what she has done is she has subjected him to absent silent treatments, removing herself from the home and then coming back, and then reinstating him as the intimate partner primary source, where they continue to interact with one another, perhaps living together for a few weeks, a few months, and then she goes off again. And therefore, there isn't actually any shift of Will to former intimate partner primary source. He has stayed the IPPS throughout. She has had an affair, and that individual was an IPSS, with Will remaining the IPPS, because she has still had a sustained level of involvement with Will. We know that they've been seen together in relation to the children, that they've been to film premieres, that they were at the Oscars. There's been many occasions. We know they've been on the Red Table Talk together. We know that they have attended therapy together. And therefore, the more likely dynamic that has occurred is that they were still actually together. She's the narcissist, he's the IPPS victim. And there will have been instances where she has removed herself from him by way of an absent silent treatment, a short separation, but she doesn't disengage from him. He doesn't become the former IPPS. He still stays the IPPS. She interacts with other people who are IPSSs, but they're not made into the IPPS. And even now, even with this revelation, and she says that they don't live together, the fact is he's still the IPPS because she still has a frequent level of involvement with him. This, of course, would all be very confusing for Will Smith because he doesn't really know whether he's coming or going. If you've separated, you've separated. Sure, you might bump into one another for the purposes of something involving the children, but largely, having separated, you would lead separate lives. But what she has done is it isn't a true and formal being apart for most of the time. I would wager they've actually spent more time together with just intermittent periods of her giving him an absent silent treatment as part of his sustained devaluation, and then has now turned around and said, oh yes, we've been separated for 7 years, when in actual fact, that's just part of the sustained devaluation. And she's calling it that as a revision of history for the purpose of drumming up interest in her book. Thus, the dynamic between the two of them, because I don't believe that there has been a proper formal 7-year separation, is that she's the narcissist and he still is the intimate partner primary source, but in devaluation. He has not escaped, and she has not yet disengaged from him. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.